Hey, welcome along. A couple of days ago, we did one of our SteynPosts about what I regard as the biggest issue of the day, which is the deathbed demography of the developed world and the demographic tsunami in other parts of the world. And I always get a lot of yes, but responses to that. And so today I thought we'd take a riffle through some of those yes, but responses from members of the Mark Steyn Club from all around the world who've made various objections to my thesis or tried to nudge it on to how it might play out in the years ahead. So taking the fact that Europe has deathbed demography, taking the fact that European countries like Greece and Germany, most of them in fact, have upside-down family trees, where does that lead? And Rich, let's start with Rich, because Rich is credentialed. He wrote his collegiate senior thesis on the impact of Muslim immigration into the Netherlands. And he says, the opportunity to play devil's advocate is too tempting. Your logic seems strong, but surely a larger generation of Muslims means a greater number of moderate Muslims, correct? It's not as if they're in a monolithic group. With Muslims being the chief victim of ISIS and terrorism, as well as being forced to live under oppressive, undemocratic Sharia law, won't the moderates and progressives eventually be compelled to speak out and act against the extreme wing of Islam? Well, Rich, that's a very interesting question. We have been in pursuit of the moderate Muslim, as it were, since 9/11. And I make a joke. I think I make it in America alone. I said something like, there's a dollar bill in the center of the crossroads, and at each of the roads leading into the crossroads, there's Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, a moderate Muslim, and a radical pro-Sharia, pro-Al-Qaeda Muslim. And who gets to the dollar bill first? And I said the radical pro-Sharia Muslim, all the others are mythical creatures. That's not technically true. There have been Muslims in the West in small numbers for a long time. A couple of them even got elected to the British Parliament in the late 19th century. But they were, simply by virtue of the fact that they were Muslims who had come to the Western world, they were moderate, fully assimilated Muslims. Now, you're talking about fertility rates here. Who are the first people to adopt Western fertility rates? They're the moderate Muslims. So the moderate Muslims their population diminishes by comparison to what one might call the traditional pro-Sharia Orthodox Muslim point of view. And the easiest way to look at this, because whenever you talk about demography, fertility rates, people think you're racist, it's all about race, it's all about color, it's all about xenophobia. So forget all that. Forget about fertility rates relative between a Muslim population and an ethnic European population, and let's just keep it all Muslim. And let's look at Turkey and the modern Turkish state. Young Turks, that's what they called the radicals who wanted to reform the Turkish caliphate in the early part of the 20th century. And after the Great War, after the First World War, the caliphate and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the new Turkish state was born under Kemal Ataturk. And I got some graphs here. I'm not in the full Al Gore, all PowerPoint thing, but I got some graphs here, and they're interesting. 1923, Turkey had 14 million people. Today, it has 80 million. Hold that thought. This is the 2014 election in Turkey. If you're wondering how we got from Kemal Ataturk to Erdogan, the new sultan, this graph tells you the whole story here. This big blotchy yellow spreading west is Erdogan's vote. This little blotch of purple down in the southeast corner are the Kurds. So pay no attention to them. They don't want to be in Turkey at all. And this little blue western strip is what we used to call Rumelian European Turkey. That's the Turkey that created the modern Kemal Ataturk Turkish Republic. And as you can see, Erdogan supporters, Anatolian rural Turkey, that's that big yellow swathe. What happened there? What's the story? How did the country that gave votes to women, that abolished the fez, that abolished Islamic coverings, that set up a modern secular republic, wind up in the hands of Sultan Erdogan, the new caliph? Well, the simple answer is that that little strip of Western European Rumelian Turkey was outbred by the great Asian rural Anatolian hinterland of Turkey, which never accepted the Kemalist secularization of the state. And so here we are. Here I've got another graph. I'm going full Al Gore here. I got graphs a go-go. Here we have the 2013 fertility chart of Turkey. As you can see, we've got this little no change in the center. That shows the fertility rate isn't increasing or declining. Here we have the increasing fertility rate. That's where the number of children is going up. And here we have where the number of children is going down. And then here, you can't really see it because the colors get a bit faded here. But in Rumelian European Turkey, we have where the fertility rate is steeply decreasing. What's the result of that? The 2017 referendum back in April, which turned Erdogan into the new strongman of the new post-Kemalist Turkish state. And as you can see, the only people who voted against him were the Kurds and this tiny little strip of Rumelian secularist Kemalist Turkey. So what we have here is a demographic story. Essentially, the moderate secular Muslim vote in Turkey was overwhelmed by the irredentist, rural, hardcore Islamic vote. And that's why you couldn't have Kemal Ataturk's Turkey today, and you'll never have it again. It's gone. It's over, because it was outbred by people who never accepted the secular Turkish state. That's what happened in Turkey. That's the short version there. Martha Byron writes, Mark, what about the tendency for immigrants to developed countries to reduce the number of children they have? Don't you think the Islamic birth rate will decline as it has in Iran, for example? That's an interesting question, Martha. If you look at Pakistanis in Britain, for example, the number of children they had in the early 70s did start to decline. And to match, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh rates of fertility. Not Irish Catholic rates. That's a separate country. I'm talking about Northern Ireland Protestants. It started to head. You would have predicted that it would have aligned with them. What happened in the 80s and 90s? The number of children that Pakistani Britons had went up. Why? Because there were more Pakistanis in Britain. So it actually became possible, instead of a Pakistani moving to Britain and living in an English, Scottish, whatever society, it became possible to move to Britain and live in a Pakistani society. So that actually now Pakistani Britons have a higher fertility rate than they did in the 1970s. They have something closer to what they have back in Pakistan. Again, why is that? Because it's a self-segregating community. In the city of Bradford in Yorkshire, 58% of Pakistani Britons are married to their first... no, I beg your pardon. That's in the nation as a whole. 58% of Pakistani Britons are married to their first cousins. In Bradford, it's 75% of Pakistani Britons who are married to their first cousins. That's an extraordinary degree of self-segregation. A lot of those 75% who are married to first cousins are themselves the children of first cousins, which means they have all these kind of health consequences, which are placing strains on the National Health Service there. But what it does mean is that there is no assimilation, and those fertility rates are resembling more and more the kind of fertility rates you would see if you were back in Mirpur, for example, in Pakistan. That's what happens, and incidentally, a lot of marriages are contracted with people from the home village back in Pakistan. So effectively, every generation is a first generation of immigrants. You see similar things in other parts of Europe. For example, Tunisians in Belgium, for example, actually have more children than Tunisians back in Tunisia do, because Tunisia was was a moderate state in its Islamic disposition, because it was a secular dictatorship, and the fertility rate declined. However, when you establish Tunisian communities, the Tunisians who fled that secular dictatorship and settled in Western Europe actually have more children than Tunisians do in Tunisia. So I'm not sure that's how it's going to end up on that. Ed writes, regarding demographics, I understand Europe's demographic problem, and it's self-evident that they need immigrants to patch up the problem. It seems that Europe is missing the obvious source of immigrants, Ukraine and Russia. Russians and Ukrainians are quite culturally compatible with Europe, albeit a bit more Christian than Europeans and with a bit more conservative family values. The added bonus is that they're incredibly well educated, with most adults having several advanced degrees. I had a lot of letters making one version or another of this argument, and it's true. For example, Spain would do much better to import immigrants from Latin America than it would from the Muslim world. Obviously, in the United Kingdom, the obvious source of immigration would be Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders from the mother country. And then you get to ones where you say, well, okay, in Western Europe, the least unassimilable immigrants will be from Eastern Europe. I think it's more basic than that. That if you have, if having children is, to use the George W. Bush formulation, one of the jobs that Americans won't do, you have a structural problem which you should address. Unless you're going to go down the Japanese path with manga-like sex bots operating as your service staff and your nurses in old folks' homes and all the rest of it, unless you're going to go down the sex bots path, the Austin Powers fembots path, then you should recognize you have a structural problem and you should do something about it, because eventually there's no point moving the population of Ukraine to Scotland. There's no point moving the population of Poland to Ireland. That in itself is a loss. I like the Irish and I like the Poles. And I'd be much happier if Ireland stayed Ireland and Poland stayed Poland. And the only way to do that is if those communities are themselves demographically healthy. And that means not just saying, oh, we need immigrants to pop up the welfare system. It means rethinking the welfare system. And it means rethinking, in effect, the basic structures of life. A century ago, you were a child till you were about 13. After that, you were an adult. You were expected to work on the farm or in the mill or wherever it was. And then you worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And then you died. Now we have a thing where you're a child until you're, 9 or 10 or whenever the Democrats say you can go on the pill. And then you're an adolescent until your early 30s. And then you work until your mid-50s, and then you have a 3-decade retirement. And in particular, that period of adolescence where we prolong education so that everyone is entitled to what would have been the leisurely varsity of the second son of a European Grand Duke in the 19th century, means that family formation starts later and later and later. So that people who would have had 2 or 3 children now just have one yuppie designer kid at the age of 39. We have to rethink that. I mean, nobody seriously thinks that keeping people in school until grade 28 is actually teaching them anything. So we ought to think back about we ought to think about cutting back that whole grade 28 approach to education and seeing if we can't wrap the whole thing up a lot quicker. Because basically, if you haven't got it right by eighth grade, you've screwed it up anyway, and it doesn't matter if they stay in school till they're 37. So immigration, a fertility rate, a diminished fertility rate, is a structural defect that ultimately cannot be corrected through immigration. Number 4, Randy Stafford. This was an interesting question to me. I'll start with the question. Does France's low fertility rate during the 19th century in any way invalidate your observation that its current woes are due to secularism and the welfare state? And in case you're not familiar with what he's talking about, most European countries had a healthy fertility rate in the 19th century. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, in 1860, the UK had 29.1 million people, and by 1910, it had 45.4 million people. Germany, even more spectacular. In 1860, it had 37.6 million people, and in 1910, it had 64.9 million people. Now you look at France. France in 1860 had 36.5 million people, and by 1910, it had gone up to just 39.5 million. So you look at that. France and Germany had about the same population in 1860. By 1910, there were 65 million Germans and little more than half of that in France, just 39.5 million Frenchmen. Now, Randy Stafford asks whether that negates my thesis that it's due to secularism and the welfare state. In fact, France in some ways was the most secular nation in Europe at that time. The French were the pioneers of contraception, interestingly, and there was certainly a de-religiosity element to French life after the French Revolution. There were also other factors, such as Napoleon changing the law so that people could only, an inheritance was divided between all the children instead of going to just one child, which in fact, if you wanted to pass on something to your kid, meant that you were there was a certain incentive to have fewer kids so that the one or two kids could inherit it instead of it being divided by. There were elements particular to France. But I found Randy's question interesting because there were always consequences to this. France's demographic weakness weakened it geopolitically. As I said, they had roughly the same number of people as the Germans in 1860. The Germans opened up such a wide gap that they had 25 million more Germans than there were Frenchmen 50 years later. What does that mean? Well, it means you've got a lot of young people who can man an army. And that's why, among many other reasons, why it led to the Great War and to millions and millions and millions of dead. Demography has consequences. Randy actually has a lot of interesting points to make, which we'll get to. At another time. Ken says, pretend there's a mathematical algorithm that can accurately predict which European nation will be the first to toss its current form of government for full Sharia. There are two variable inputs, the demographic trends you speak of and the growth of PC restrictions on speech and political dissent. Question, which nation will be the first to go dark? Belgium, Sweden, Britain, Holland, Luxembourg. Well, since you've listed those questions, I'll give you a simple answer, Sweden. I think bicultural societies are always inherently unstable when they're in a state of flux. Sometimes they're benignly unstable, as, say, Quebec or Northern Ireland is. Sometimes it's a little more so, like the turmoil they've seen in Fiji, with the native Fijians and the Indians that the British imported to be the civil service and shopkeeper class. Sometimes it can be quite murderously so, as in Bosnia in the 1990s. But bicultural societies are always inherently unstable. And if they're not genuinely multicultural, if there's just two communities, then it becomes a lot easier to argue that the will of the ascendant community prevails. And in that sense, I think Sweden will just implode at a certain point and actually will start having totally self-segregated parts of that state that live under de facto Sharia, and then actually, at some point further down the line, actually a formalized Sharia. Baron writes, is it Baron Trump? I don't know. I think I've just got the name Baron. Maybe it's a Baron. Anyway, it's either Baron Trump or a member of the House of Lords. Baron writes, what worries about your argument on demography, Mark, is that the trend can be reversed. I pointed out that in Greece, 100 grandparents have 42 grandchildren. And Barron says, if the 42 or whatever Greek children decide to marry have 5 children each, one ends up with 43 old people and over 200 young. No. No, actually, you're doing the math there, because it takes 2 people to make 1 child. You've got to have a mummy and a daddy. Unless you have it. They've got new ways of doing it now, apparently. But that's still, most people still doing it the old-fashioned way. So you've got 42 of those Greek grandchildren. If each couple has 5 children, that's 105 children. So you don't recover that quickly. Demographic, and I would make a broader point here, that decline is always easier than recovery. You know this if you look at any American city. It's much easier to destroy Detroit than it is to rebuild it. It's much easier to destroy any society than it is to rebuild it. And the reason why a fertility rate of 1.3 children per couple or below is what demographers call lowest low fertility is because at that point you're too demographically weak to recover from it. There are too few of you. You're generally a small group within a larger group, and the larger group is pressurizing you in various ways. And once you get to that point, you cannot recover. Now, maybe we're a much more advanced society than previous societies, so maybe we'll find a way. And that brings us to our last question from Alcuin D. Okay, I'll shoot. What about the futurist Ray Kurzweil's singularity option? We'll all have our brains scanned and upload them to the great cloud at Amazon, I guess. And whenever we need or want to, we can take on physical form as a femtobot swarm. Actually, I mentioned Ray Kurzweil and the singularity in After America. This is this guy. The singularity is basically a sort of techno-rapture. Ray Kurzweil has decided he's going to live 700 years. Now, he accepts that a lot of his body parts will be all worn out by then. So the essence of him is going to be uploaded into some form, not necessarily the cloud at Amazon. Because, by the way, I don't trust Amazon or YouTube or Google or any of the monopoly providers, not to get picky about which of us they let into the big singularity, if those guys are running things. But this idea that we would be, in effect, we'd be like the old joke they make in my corner of New Hampshire about the axe, when old-timers say, I've had this axe for 73 years. Sure, I've replaced the handle 15 times and I've replaced the blade 6 times, but it's still the same old sturdy axe I've had since 1942. And the singularity is a bit of essentially is a kind of version of that. We will exist. It won't be life after death. It will be life in lieu of death as an eternal present tense. I don't particularly want to do that. I like flesh and blood human beings. I'm happy to extend life expectancy. It'd be great if we could live to there's 140-year-old guys swaggering around on the nude beaches of Saint-Tropez on the Riviera and then going into town to hit on waitresses. That's one thing. Once we get into the post-human future, I think the Japanese are going to be the ones to watch on that. Some of these robot nurses they're designing for the old folks' homes, are awfully attractive. I don't particularly go for that manga look myself, the big flat face with the white. But you know, if you're a generation raised on Japanese animation, then the chances are your ideal woman looks a lot more than like a Japanese animation than it does like a Playboy bunny or whatever. So if you're in the old folks' home and you've got this fantastic manga nurse turning you down, and you're actually a wealthy old Japanese guy and you've got a nice inheritance, why, you should be able to sweet-talk that robot into giving you benefit of clergy, and she ending her days as the Anna Nicole Smith, or whatever the name of that wrinkled old geezer she took up with. So I would say the singularity may well come, but the interim stage will be the Japanese marrying robots. How the hell did we wind up there? That's I'm not going to go beyond that. it's a you know who I always wanted to marry? Betty Rubble in the Flintstones. Is she available? What's Barney doing now? I haven't seen him in years. Anyway, on that note, we will see you next time.